So now I guess we do the two discussants, 5 minutes each. The first discussant is Rohit Aggarwala, who is chair of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group and environmental lead at Bloomberg Philanthropies. About 5 years ago, a group said that there were city studies on climate change mitigation adaptation. I said, boy, that could be very interesting. And I was forced by physical means to invite a dozen or so such people, and I was just blown away. This is actually apropos of Arnulf's things. So Rohit's been a key guy in this. I was telling him he already knew that the students here have selected Michael Bloomberg, his boss, to be the commencement speaker this year. It's just way cool, as the kids say. As you from Europe probably saw, he changed his political stance to neutral to Obama for reasons he may now describe to us. So I'll let Rohit take it from here.
Okay, thank you, John. So I will really focus my comments more on the urban chapter. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here and to comment on this really important piece of work. And the fact that the GEA now includes an urban chapter is, of course, a significant decision in and of itself. One of the more ironic things I took away, and I mean this half in jest, but only half perhaps, is that with the observation that 75% of the world's GDP and 75% of its energy consumption is in cities and the rural population is going to be going down, at some point an urban chapter becomes irrelevant and a rural chapter should be what you have, right? Because the rest of it has to be about the urban environment. But let me talk for a minute both about your comments, Arnulf, which I suspect you were exaggerating to make a point. Your point is fair. I'm going to say a few things in defense of the importance of megacities, take issue with one of the observations you made about some of the challenges we face, but then reinforce one of the observations you made about the challenges that we face. So the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group is an organization of megacities. We have 63 member cities, much like the Big Ten. We chose not to change the number when we expanded. But nonetheless, and what I find really important about megacities is three things. One, they have power. Two, they have the will to change. And three, they actually set the tone for the rest of the urban environment. And so what do I mean by that? In terms of powers, the C40 actually now, when Mayor Bloomberg took over, in fact, I'm special advisor to the chair. Mayor Bloomberg is the chair of the C40. When he took over as chair a couple of years ago, one of the things we realized is there was no source of information to catalog what powers the mayors of these 63 cities actually possessed. So we undertook to do that. So 2 years ago, C40 published a paper that Arup worked with us on. We're going to update it again at the beginning of next year, called Climate Action in Megacities. And among the things we did is for 36 of our largest cities, we cataloged of all the main climate-relevant policy areas. Where did power in that city reside? National, regional, municipal, etc., whatever the layers were. And we found some fascinating things. Mayors are insanely powerful, particularly when it comes to climate change. If you think about the areas that matter in this policy arena, whether it's transportation, whether it's solid waste, whether it's local air quality and the kinds of combustion that takes place within cities, basically the only topics related to energy consumption and climate change that mayors don't have significant power over is agriculture policy and grid electricity generation. Right? The rest, mayors have significant control. The vast majority, 70% of all mayors, are responsible for dealing with solid waste. More than half of mayors around the world have integrated transportation control in the sense that they control both the local streets and the transit system. right? And similarly, the majority of mayors actually have local zoning power, right? And so with that set of powers, you actually have the ability to do the kind of integrated planning that you collectively, in terms of the authors of the chapter, cite as being the key to getting this right. The second thing is that these cities actually have the will to act. And there is, just as there is a difference in the way the cities consume and the way wealth is concentrated, and the difference in the industrial mix of these cities, what we've seen over and over again is that large cities tend to have a greater willingness to make change on these issues than the national governments do. Right? We certainly have seen this in the United States, but in fact it's not just an American phenomenon. We've seen it in Korea, where the city of Seoul drove the policy of the Korean government. We've seen it in Brazil, where São Paulo and Rio, in fact building on the early achievements of Curitiba, but I think it was São Paulo and Rio that really drove the change. We've seen it in South Africa, where Johannesburg and Cape Town have really put this on the agenda. And so I think we see that as a political factor just because of the mix of who people are, what their interests are. I think the third thing I'll point out is that megacities really set their cultural norms for what urban life is. And this is going to be increasingly important, I think, in the developing world, where, as you pointed out, the wealth, just the consuming power, is concentrated in the cities, right? And therefore that defines the good life, and that's the aspiration, and that's part of what's driving rapid urbanization. But we see that in policy, and we see that in economics. So, one fact that we have for the C40, of course we have lots of facts, this one still stuns me. The 63 mayors in the C40, if you include their metro population for each of these megacities, have 1/12 of the world's population. 8% of all humans live within a C40 city. 21% of the world's GDP is in the C40. Right? That is where the multiplier effect of megacities are. And I think you see that when policy cascades, that whether it's what we've seen recently, New York's about to launch bike sharing. Now bike sharing is a global phenomenon, really started in Paris. We saw bus rapid transit really take off as a policy initiative really after Bogota adopted it. Now that's a megacity by any definition, and that had a global impact. We've seen this in the past as well. Among the more important things and among New York's negative contributions to the world was Robert Moses, who not only reshaped the landscape of New York City, but influenced the way the United States defined good cities, and in fact himself, he was a consultant to the Venezuelan government. New York wound up setting the model for all sorts of urban form, unfortunately in a bad way. That was 50 years ago. Hopefully we'll do it better going forward. Which then leads to the flip side, which is that I actually think that the small and medium-sized cities where you rightly define the growth taking place is the more difficult challenge, right? Because whereas a big city, we used to talk about New York, gets more like New York when it becomes more dense, more transit-oriented, more walkable. In a city of 100,000 people, you actually have a hurdle. If you get more dense, you're going to have more congestion in terms of traffic, because it's not already transit-oriented or walkable. If you get more dense, or if you want to get more transit-oriented, you have to get more dense, which usually means you're changing the visual landscape. And so it's not just a powers thing, it's also a cultural and political issue that these small and medium-sized cities face.
Can you wrap up in a minute?
Sorry?
Can you wrap up in a minute?
Yes, in less than that. So I think the summation I'd have on your chapter is, I think you're totally right to ask people to focus on small to medium size as the area where the challenge is, but I think the megacities will help define what the goal is. The pathway will be different for the smaller places. Thank you.
Yeah. Our second discussant is Chris Flavin, well known to all of us, another kind of mega superstar, particularly in this community. He's founder and president of the World Watch Institute, making his name synonymous with that institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. even this one chapter is an extraordinary piece of work, and we've only been able to hear a few very small highlights of what I'm biased, but I think this is maybe the most important chapter, and then sort of lays out the scenarios and where we might be headed going forward.
Okay.
That's better.
So I just wanted to sort of pull out 6 things that I think are particularly important messages that come out of this chapter. The first, I think we have to remind ourselves just how difficult this is to do, to accomplish the scenarios that have been laid out. I mean, I think it's easy, as we see them described, and everybody says, well, it's very much doable. We can have access for all. We can have energy security. We can decarbonize the economy. We can simply lay it out in a computer model. We're, of course, not anywhere close to actually headed in that direction. And, if you look at what virtually every sort of mainstream body is projecting and what is conventional wisdom of what is possible in Washington or Brussels or Beijing, it's a totally different picture of the world. So I just, we're here, probably a fairly like-minded group, and, we've got a study we really like, but I think we have to remind ourselves that this is not exactly the real world in terms of at least the politics of it. Second, I think the energy access is obviously a very important element that this was sort of brought in as a central element of the study. For those that don't know, I think there are probably some good academic reasons for doing this as well, maybe some good social reasons, but there's also the sort of global politics. We're in now, and I guess it's called the decade of sustainable energy for all, which is an official sort of United Nations Secretary General way of sort of organizing a stepped up UN effort on energy. And why is it sustainable? Sustainable energy, that's of course decarbonization. For all, that's basically the access. Why are these two? I think we would all agree they're both important goals, but why were they sort of put together in this very, important sort of, global entity? To be very simple about it, the industrial countries wanted the decarbonization and the developing countries wanted the access, and so it is in effect a political compromise, though I would argue that it's a good one. But I think the conclusion here is an interesting one, which is, as the report says, the impact of if we do it in the right way of going to 100% energy access is going to have a negligible impact on emissions. Now, I think we have to be honest about ourselves. I think it goes both directions. I don't think almost anything we could do in rural, in off-grid areas is going to make more than a smidgen of difference in terms of where we need to get on the carbon track. But it is clearly very important in its own right, and I want to applaud you for, in effect, solving 2 simultaneous equations here on behalf of the Secretary General. Third, and just very briefly, this is something that Naki, you and I have both worked on over the years, and this is the idea that to get to a sustainable energy system, we're going to have to move, we went from solid fuels, coal, wood, to liquid fuel dominance in the latter part of the 20th century, to the idea being that the gaseous fuels become a common energy carrier along with electricity going forward. I do think that while it's not emphasized in these scenarios, I think you're really pointing in that direction. Basically the idea that we're gonna use natural gas more heavily in the short run, but the long run, the energy carrier, in addition again to electricity, is probably going to need to be hydrogen, but it's a relatively logical path. One of the things that suddenly occurred to me that had not before, as I listened to the discussion here, is that LPG or propane, I think, is going to play a bigger role than a lot of people realize. We're going to basically have an excess supply for some time to come. It's much cleaner than hydrogen diesel is much cleaner than burning biomass. It's much more globally fungible, transportable than natural gas is. I think we need to think about how is propane going to fit into this whole equation of the sort of move to a gradual move to a hydrogen economy. Fourth, and this is something that I found at least sort of missing in this chapter, and I've not read all of the other chapters, so it's probably somewhere else in this 1,800-page report. By the way, I was very thankful for the iPad, so I didn't have to carry all 13 pounds around. I think it probably weighs 50 times what my iPad does. But this is the subject of distributed generation. I mean, to me, that this is the biggest sort of neglected topic in terms of one of the things that we need to do going forward for a whole variety of reasons, but including decarbonization. It's the big sort of missed opportunity in the electricity sector. Everybody loves to talk about smart grid, wonderful technologies, but one of the main ways in which they're going to be useful is basically enabling a more distributed electricity system. Let's be honest, our electric utilities, our national energy policy makers, our state energy policy makers are for the most part biased against distributed power, and it needs to be emphasized. But I think that there's one piece missing, but this I think relates very closely to a point that was made earlier, is that distributed generation is not just about wind and solar and intermittent resources. It's also got to be about conventional fuels. I mean, in Germany they're using 20 kilowatt natural gas generators based in people's homes. Propane could play the same role in developing countries. You go to island countries, you ask, well, how are they going to deal with 80% renewables, which would be more economical than the system they did? Well, we're going to need storage, and it's going to take decades to develop. Well, wait a minute, you've got all these diesel generators on your system. Just don't throw them away. Rather than baseload, use them for backup. So I think that if we really emphasize distributed generation in a way that we haven't, both technology-wise and policy-wise, it'll make it that much easier to get to a low-carbon economy. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So I've collected from the panel a bunch of challenging questions, but I thought I would start with a kind of a softball question. That is, I'm kind of excited about this question in view of the end of the last panel and this entire panel. So the question I have, which is looking forward to tomorrow and maybe further work, is, are we dreaming big enough and are we trying hard enough? The Occupy movement was mentioned before, just in passing, the 360 movement. These kids have their heart in the right place, but to me, they are the window smashers of the war protest years that I grew up in. Sally mentioned 200 energy faculty here. What's your estimate on how many kids we have in each class? Stanford has 1,700 undergrads a year, maybe 200 each class across science and engineering, law, economics, business. 30 in each for undergrads?
Oh, for undergrads.
Yeah, undergrads. 200, 150. I work with a lot of them. These are some of the best students here. The way they look at this is, do we really need political will? The heck with political will. Do we really need government? I mean, this is kind of these kids are actually hunkering down and actually trying to solve the problem and not get on TV and interviewed. So just to not hold back at all, the way they might put it, I don't want to speak for them, is why do we need all this big stuff and huge investments? Isn't this way of thinking really just a big, dating myself once again, new industrial state, too big to fail pile of crap? So who wants to talk first? That's my one and only question. Sorry to take so long. Anybody want to take that challenge? Arnulf, you inspired me with your new model. Hisham, with your perspective. I like the city angles. Are there things we haven't thought about? I mean, this is Silicon Valley after all. Most of these, half of these kids are entrepreneurs, and they don't take no for an answer. They'll work with Sally on technology. Institutions aren't bad. Let's work around it. Let's do something completely differently.
I'll take a first crack at it with Al. No, we're not thinking big enough in many ways, and I think let me tie it to two different things that I've kind of one thing that Chris was talking about, and one thing that was talked about briefly during this set of presentations, but I think really needs to be emphasized, which is we're talking about systems here. We're all talking about systems and modeling systems, and a lot of us love to do systems modeling, but there's no unitary decision maker out there saying this is what the system's going to look like, right? It's an aggregate of a whole bunch of subsystems that each are being decided by policymakers, consumers, engineers at firms, leaders of firms, energy decision makers at firms. You know, it's all aggregating up, and so we can talk about all the system, but in fact, what is going to happen is it's going to need people like your students to go out and do really cool things and have it get picked up. Now the problem is, how is it going to get picked up? The problem is the system. Now, the system, not the energy system, but the system as a political institutional system doesn't always allow their students to exercise that creativity that they would like to do. Get back to Chris's point on distributed power generation. I spend a lot of time when working on distributed power generation. I think it's great. One of the really cool things with distributed power generation is not the technology. It is that by going to a more distributed system, it opens up the institutional space, right? You move away from, look, a centralized power generation system requires a centralized institutional system, right? It requires big regulators, right? It requires big companies. A distributed system, the big companies can play in the distributed system world. That's fine. They want to play in that world, they can play in that world. But they're not the only ones who can play in that world. That's what's exciting about distributed power generation. It's not just the technology, right? It's the opening up of the business models that can be exploited. The opening up of the technologies that can be exploited, if it's allowed to be exploited.
Great.
That's my answer to that question.
Great. It reminds me of that young precocious student whose thesis I read. Naki.
Okay, I also want to go back to the issue of the students. Is this on?
Thanks. That's much better. Now I can hear myself. Yeah, I wanted to comment on the statement about the students, because my day job is teaching in Vienna, not in Silicon Valley, but in center of Vienna, so urban university, quite different than here with the campus. But over 10 years, I have seen a profound change. In the energy area that I teach, basically, I would say we had about 20 exceedingly motivated and interested students. Now we have on the order of 60 to 80, depending how you count it. And with I think, great intentions, but they're mostly engineers, so I think that goes more closer to the paradigm, solving problems. And I think actually the institutional dimension, economics, that's a little bit more difficult to communicate, but huge amount of enthusiasm. And just a few weeks ago, I gave a talk to about 600 high school students, and I have to say that was an enriching experience. First of all, because they asked the questions normally you don't get, because, people are, maybe too embarrassed to ask the difficult question, or simply, this question has been asked many times in academic environments. The students did, and I think it was really great. And the tenor of the question is, what can we do? Tell us what we can do on the ground, what is specific things that we can do. So I think this is, I think that makes me more optimistic. I think the young generation is clearly, by definition, the pioneers of change. So not only the Occupy people, but also people who are trying to change something I think, in a more constructive manner. Let me just add one comment to your question. I think what we are missing, and that's now a little bit separate from the global energy assessment, but I think what we are missing, and somebody said it, is a shared vision. I think without a vision, it's very difficult to make this massive change. And Chris, I mean, I essentially agree with everything Chris said, but you also said it's very difficult to do, and I think you were referring to modeling and technical aspects of scenarios, but also how to come to an agreement among so many different authors. But it's difficult in this broader sense, not just in the sense of constructing scenarios, but actually having a new vision and a social contract. I think we have lost a little bit of that. After the Second War, we had that. People seem to all know where one should go, and that was better life. Now better life is something different. It's sustainable life, and I don't think we have a social consensus on that. I think that's the biggest obstacle.
Great. Anybody else? I don't know if I do you. Swing on it.
Trying to answer to your question also and reflecting a little bit on the distinguished panel. I think what I would say to a student is, in view of the political system's reality, GEA dreams too big. In view of what is needed and what are the opportunities out there, dream big, but dream the right dreams. One of the things that almost puzzles me is, why some technologies can reach consumers so fast. The cell phone was mentioned X times already today, yes? 4 billion people over the last 10 years got access to a cell phone worldwide. We still have 4 billion people that do not have access to a toilet after 100 years of inventing the flush toilet. So why we cannot bring toilets in 100 years to 4 billion people, but we can bring cell phones in 10 years to 4 billion people? So my answer to this is very, very simple. It's the nature of the technology. The infrastructure requirements are small. The technology is granular, small scale, is very cheap. And on top of it, it provides a useful service beyond the original intention. So what the sociologists of technology call interpretive flexibility. You need a cell phone in rural Africa, not because you want to chat to your neighbor, you can do this over the fence, but in order to transfer money because there is no banking system. And this transfer of money was actually invented by people, not by the bankers, not by, Google or any other company. It was developed on the ground by people, by entrepreneurial people. And it is the nature of the technology, the cell phone, that allows this so-called interpretive flexibility. I'm missing a little bit creative examples in the energy space that allow also this interpretive flexibility. One example is a flip side. I'm sorry to be flippant today, but it's my usual nature. Are fake PV panels you can put on your roof to impress your neighbors, but they don't produce electricity. So it's an example of an interpretive flexibility of an energy technology. Namely, you impress your neighbors. We are even in the pure technology space, when we do all of this exergy analysis, a usual question I ask my students is, what is the biggest energy flow worldwide? And they all answer, it's oil or coal or whatever. And they say, no, it's waste heat. No, there are a lot of technologies, direct conversion of heat into electricity, Sievert effect. So, BMW is investing in it. So where are these examples of, creative solutions that offer this kind of interpretive flexibility? And I think that might be the big dream students could dream here in Stanford and elsewhere.
Great. Chris or Rohit, do you want to say it on this subject?
But just quickly, for students today who are interested in this field, I think that you could not have a better time to be entering the field, because I think that the opportunities are enormous at every level. Whether you want to be a solar engineer or you want to be a high-level policymaker, and dozens of other kinds of professional jobs. Things I think are really going to open up tremendously in the next few years. And I say that as somebody who's been in the field for 30 years. And I've got to confess that when I got into it and was the age of Stanford, that Stanford students are today, I would have thought we would be much further along today than we are. There was this period of, what I think turned out to be, sort of false optimism in the 1980s. We really thought, we were going to sort of leap forward. And, I think it's partly that the technologies were not ready, but I think it's more fundamentally that the politics turned out to be much, much more difficult. The entrenched interests, the electric utilities in particular, ended up being, I think, a bigger problem than what a lot of people thought. But I, with that perspective of time, I'm also, quite confident that we're into a period of really accelerated change in the energy system now. You see that in part because there are a number of national governments and state governments that are already, leaping forward so quickly. I mean, Germany's, gone in 15 years from 4% to 25% renewables on their electricity system. Almost all of the delta is solar and wind. It's not, none of it is traditional hydro. And they've done that because they've changed their policies. And other countries are seeing what is needed, what is possible if you change your policy framework. So I think the opportunities are really going to open up, and I hope at least some of the students will get into the policy side, which I think is going to be if you look at, there are all these sort of interlocking things, and one thing leads to the other, but if I was going to identify one thing that's most holding us back, including holding back the science and engineering, it's bad policy.
Excellent. Any other comments on that question?
If I could just
sure.
The one thing that, since maybe everything's been said by everybody, or by everything's been said, but not by everybody, but the one observation I'll make is that, as you point out, Chris, when it comes to changing systems, you've got lots of interests, right? Which the kind of consumer product rebellion approach to seceding from, the same old stuff, and I'm going to do it my own way and buy my own phone or whatever. That's fine if you can find a way to separate yourself, but it doesn't necessarily work to change a system where you've got entrenched interest, where you've got neighbors, etc. However, the only thing more powerful than that is massive consumer demand, right? Which is the flip side of your cell phone analogy, that there was such demand for it. And one of the things that I am looking for, and I think we see the beginnings of, is the simple demand for defining greater efficiency, urbanization, et cetera, as a better life. And when we flip that switch publicly, when you get the marketing people, so it's not just the engineering school and whatever, it's also the business school and the sociology folks and whatever, selling this stuff, then I think you can overcome.
Yeah, I think for me, for just backing up what you guys have just said, I think we're going to see a really rapid movement to social media being used in this way, and big data and so on. Am I on? Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to chime in and say, for almost all these comments, I think the thing that's going to change really rapidly is the ability to use big data and social media to do exactly what you guys just said, is to unify people and try to actually do coordination in ways that we just haven't thought about before. I think it's going to be exciting. Why don't we turn to audience questions at this point? Let's start in the back over there, and then Mark Jackard can go next. In the back first.
I guess it's on. Sach Constantine, I'm the Director of Policy for the California Center for Sustainable Energy. Among other things, we help administer the California Solar Initiative and the Self-Generation Incentive Program and the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project here in the state of California. So we're on the ground doing a lot of the things that you've been talking about today. And I really want to amplify what Chris was talking about and what Hisham was talking about just now in this discussion, and what was mentioned earlier. Arun talked about distributed generation and its transformative possibilities. It's really interesting to me that we've heard that echoed through many of the discussions today, but the analysis and the methodology suggests that there's a very limited potential for DG. This morning, I believe the graph showed in one of your scenarios for 2030, a very small percentage of the renewable energy actually coming from, let's say, rooftop or greenfield development. And I just wonder if there's a danger in those methodological constraints affecting the ability of DG to have these transformative effects, because it discourages the uptake of it. It discourages people from doing exactly, Hisham, what you talked about, is breaking the traditional paradigm, when the potential is really still there. We just can't model it very well.
Okay, I have Chris and then Naki on this one.
Yeah,
Naki to go first.
Start, yeah.
Naki and then Chris.
You should,
No,
you should respond first. Yeah.
I think it's probably probably a good flow, yeah.
Okay,
If I'm guessing what you're going to say.
Just a very, very quick response. I think, it depends what the system boundaries are. For example, in the context of access, the rooftop collectors can make a huge difference. And on top of it, if you look, going back to the mobile phones that we already discussed, if you calculate loading a mobile phone with a diesel small generator that somebody brings around on the horse cart, this is a practice where you have no access to electricity, can cost $5 to $10 per kilowatt hour equivalent. At that, you can buy photovoltaics very cheap if there is a business model to provide a service. So I think it really depends in the context. So on-site can be a major component of a transformation where people have no access.
Great, Chris, and then up to Mark.
So I think in the way you just frame it, Naki, I think you're still underestimating distributed. I mean, I agree with the questioner. I really think that it can and it almost certainly will. If we move to lower carbon energy, I think it will become, in terms of at least new build, new generation, I think it will dominate. I think it will be much larger than the central generation will be. And I mean, the thing that of course has been revolutionary is this dramatic, 3/4 decline in the price of solar over the last several years. So suddenly, it really is going to be tremendously economic to do rooftop solar systems. And I think we've only begun to see, various societies, communities sort of take advantage of what that is going to offer. Germany, of course, is doing it. Germany went from, a decade ago, probably several hundred generators hooked up to their system. They now have well over 1 million, and they're going to be at 2 million within a couple of individual generators going into their system. From a societal point of view, it is revolutionary because suddenly the consumers become producers, and suddenly the voters become producers. They're not just takers. It's not just the utility on one side of the equation, which is very politically powerful as lobbyists in Washington and Sacramento. Suddenly, it is everybody, and I think that is going to be a bigger part of this low carbon energy future than probably the energy assessment is acknowledging at this point.
Hisham, you had something?
One quick story about how DG already plays a role in solving access problems, which is, and by the way, I also echo what Chris said in terms of the broader implications of DG, and I couldn't agree more. But on the access side, I was doing some research in Cambodia on DG, and if you look at the official Cambodian electrification rate, it's 15%, 1.5. That's at the time that I was there, and that's because that's who got electricity through the official electricity company and the official distribution companies. If you look at the Cambodian Statistical Office's household survey, 50% of households had a television. Okay, where are all those other people getting their electricity from? Rural electricity entrepreneurs, meaning a person, a man or woman in the village who went and bought a diesel generator, hooked up basically glorified extension cord into a microgrid, and charged car batteries when they weren't running it over the microgrid. And that's how the majority of the population was. I mean, it was probably about 85% of the population having lights. Right? It's happening already. It will happen. It will continue to happen. Yeah. Right? The question is, how do we do it more efficiently? I mean, the prices that they were having to charge, not because they were gouging their customers, but because the technology was inefficient, it was poorly designed, poorly maintained, et cetera, et cetera. Doing it better is the question, and doing it more, right?
Let's move to another question. Mark Jackard.
Mark Jackard, Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I'm still grappling with Arnulf's problem about how to get toilets to everybody. So you said with the phones they had multiple uses. We need to figure out some way that toilets have different additional uses.
Don't go there. Don't go there.
Okay. Well, we'll keep thinking about it. But Hisham, there. A mobile toilet, yeah, or a toilet that's a phone.
Was that your actual question?
No, sorry, I couldn't resist. Hisham, I was really glad that you started talking about policy, because I'm on for policy tomorrow, but what I'm really going to say is, well, every section should have been talking about policy, because there's so much to do. And so I was really glad that you did that. You said, here's the policy. We're going to subsidize the consumption of energy as a way of energy access. And then I was thinking, oh boy, I'm going to ask Hisham, how are you going to pay for that? Like, where does it come from? And then you very wisely said, and I know someone's going to ask such and such, so you laid it out for us. But I used to work in this area, and I haven't for several years, and I'm having trouble grappling with your idea of the subsidy to consumption. Like, I can think of programs where it'll be a subsidy to the capital equipment, something like that, and even the microfinance can work into that. But whenever we try to do subsidies for consumption, like trying to work that out, who pays, and in a budgetary sense, for something that may really grow over time can really be a challenge. And so what we've seen, at least a lot of the programs that I used to see and sort of stuff through the World Bank, it was more sort of the one-shot equipment that someone got, except if it's electricity, because then you can do some cross-subsidy between. So I'm still challenged a little bit on, let's say you're thinking of a subsidy to LPG, for example. Yeah, like where the money comes from.
Sure, same subject. Yeah, Hisham, I assume you want to reply. Yeah, okay.
Because my question was exactly related to that. I was also going to ask, if you already diverse subsidy, why don't you propose subsidy of the capital equipment? Right? Because you only had microfinance for the first cost, and then fossil fuel subsidies, which we argued already several times this event that brings in the end wrong responses. So why didn't you consider at least capital subsidies?
Okay, so I'm going to give the Weasley answer, and then I'm going to give the non-Weasley answer. The Weasley answer is actually what you just saw on all the subsidies and financing stuff was from Chapter 17, of which I did not participate in. That was the Modeling Pathways chapter. I wouldn't have done it that way. Okay, so that's my mea culpa. It wasn't me, right? I didn't do it. The other part of the answer is I agree. Yeah, I agree with you, right? That in fact there's two issues here. It's capital and it's ongoing costs. I do think that the capital upfront costs are a big issue. I've actually written about this elsewhere, right? And that solving that capital upfront cost problem is big. I've talked about how you might do it through various types of financing schemes, including direct subsidies for capital, though that can be tricky to do as well. But not having it as a consumption subsidy. However, having said that, while I agree that the evidence for the effectiveness and efficiency of consumption subsidies is pretty bad, in theory, one could design a subsidy system that was better. Would it be perfect? No. Will it be necessary to meet these goals? It very well might be. That's a sad fact. What we might have to do is we might have to accept some inefficiencies, because you can't design a perfect subsidy system, to get the fuel at a price that is at a level that people who need it can afford it. We can definitely do it better. We can tie it to all kinds of other things to prevent the leakage. We can create sunset clauses. We can, there's a bunch of stuff we can do to do it much better than's been done in the past and your experience. I would have done something. I mean, had I been involved in that part of the work, I would have actually had a broader portfolio of options on the capital cost front. But I don't think we should throw the baby with the bathwater just because we haven't been able to do subsidies very well in the past on consumption. When it comes to rural poor,
I was just thinking more about the quantity rather than efficiency. I'm just where would that money, like trying to get... It's 8%,
it's less than 8% of current, I mean, it's less than 8% of current subsidies, right? So, I mean, it grows, granted, it grows, and this is why you need to have it targeted, sunsetted, right, in a proper way, so that, in fact, what you are able to do is not have the subsidy balloon over time, right? It's a matter of the subsidy design has to be better.
Thank you. I just had a quick question for you all. I was interested in your reaction to I think the real key point that Deanna made in her presentation discussions earlier, and that is the real key to a sustainable energy future is the focus on energy services, not energy per se. I mean, that to me is literally the bottom line we have, and it really takes us back to the whole idea of Thomas Edison. When he invented electricity, he focused on, he said, it's electricity service. The technology was not there to do it outside of a little corner of Manhattan at the time. But as time went on, of course now, and in today's digital world, there is no reason why we have to maintain this ancient system that we have that is horribly inefficient. A coal-based power system today, the fraction of energy that ends up being used at the end of the whole system is less than 5%. I mean, you're losing 95% of the energy thrown away. Anyway, let me stop. The question was, I thought that was a really good, what I'd call a fundamental factor around which both policy and the business models today need to be focused. And we need to have the priorities and the incentives on that. And that's where government and all should go. Thank you.
Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think that that's a very key way of framing it. And I think that this actually, connects in an interesting way to the points that have been made about distributed generation, because demand-side management and distributed generation, from the system's point of view, they're essentially identical. I mean, in terms of the economics and what you're seeing on the system as a whole. If you can save a kilowatt hour more cheaply than you can generate it, then you should do that. And the system should. We should have an open system where those are being, treated in the same way. But I think it is very interesting that you see, I think the most dynamic development around the world is in two areas. It is on the demand side management, and it's in the distributed generation. And when you think about it, they're both enabled by the smart grid, and they're really basically two sides of the same coin. Look at a country like Germany. I mean, they're having, one of the reasons they're having to invest so heavily on the demand side now is because with their increased intermittency in the power supply system, demand, it's much cheaper than buying, batteries is to regulate your demand. So that's sort of the first option, and I think we all need to pursue them all together under this auspices of energy services.
So, okay, Rohit, you can...
If I could, I think one of the other things I'd point out, at least from my perspective, so much of the discussion around energy services, smart grid, et cetera, has focused on this issue of reducing total cost of service. But to continue to build on Arnulf's point about the technologies that have other uses, recently there was an article in the New York Times about young people ceasing to drive as much because they'd rather ride the bus and surf the web. Right? That's an alternative use, right? You're not saying take public transit. You're saying have an extra hour to surf the web. And I think the more we can find those kinds of opportunities built in, we'll be successful.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, Naki.
Yeah, I'm glad that Court raised this issue, and I think Diana has done most justice to GEA with that respect, because energy services was the organizational principle of providing GEA, and I think of conducting GEA, and I think this is one of the problems that we have today, is that much of the energy economics is about kilowatt hours and tons of oil rather than about services. Yeah. And but as we move toward more service-oriented, which I hope we need new business models to go toward more service-oriented modus operandi of the system. But the problem that also has a problem with it is that the human behavior will make a bigger impact than in the current system. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. Energy efficient houses, zero energy houses have a lot to do with what people do when they live in them. So demand side management is a slightly different game than we have had with the historical energy systems, and more on a personal experience. I bought 6 months ago an electric car. That has changed my life toward energy efficiency a lot, because you want to get that extra mile out of every kilowatt hour. More intercontinental.
Okay, so now we're going to do Kirk Smith and responses, and then Sally responses, and then Sally gives the close. Kirk.
I wanted to address this business of subsidy related to household fuels. That was a very different framing. We spend $100 billion roughly a year on controlling outdoor air pollution in this country. We think it's well worth it. Now that doesn't occur but directly by subsidy, but it costs us to do it through the regulations and the controls on everything, all the sources of outdoor air pollution. It costs society far more, actually, than it would cost to control household air pollution and the health effects from that. So part of the problem is that there's nobody to blame. There's no wood industry to regulate, or dung industry, or whatever the household fuels are. It's a natural and ancient thing. But the other side, the negative side, the dark side of it is, it's that's the prejudice against poor people all over the world, and it occurs, or the ignoring them, or however you want to say it. Those kind of exposures would not be tolerated anywhere else in the world, but they are tolerated in poor people in developing countries. And that I can tell you that the Clean Air Act in India doesn't say that they're only going to protect urban people from air pollution. It says they protect all Indian citizens, and yet they do nothing. So, and the cost is not high by comparison to what the Indians even are starting to do for outdoor air pollution, because they're concerned. But the same pollution, comes indoors, goes out there. There's no difference. You notice I didn't use the word indoor because it's just bad combustion and the fact that people breathe the results of it that causes the problem. So, I think you got to reframe around some other way besides subsidy to explain this. It's an investment. It's a social investment. Just as spending $100 billion in this country to control outdoor air pollution is a social investment that nobody argues. It's very cost effective. All the cost benefit studies show that it is, just as it is in Europe. Well, why aren't the households in rural India also part of that calculus? That's really the issue. Now, maybe we need to be smarter on how we do it through maybe the ID cards in India, and so forth, to get these technologies to people. But the costs are low compared to what we already spend to protect ourselves.
Great. Any responses to that? That was kind of a great
Yeah, I agree with you entirely, Kirk. And the cost-benefit analyses that have been done, and I know, show clearly benefits well higher than cost. I think part of the issue is we can calculate that benefit-cost ratio, but those benefits and costs accrue to different people, and some of it's monetized and some of it's not monetized, and some of it's, and how it's framed makes it very difficult to sort of move the system. And so I agree entirely that the framing of it and the question around how you deal with the non-monetary aspects of it, and how you deal with the split incentive problems, even within the government, right? It's the health ministry who's bearing the burden of costs in a lot of places, and it's the energy ministry who's going to bear the burden of a subsidy. Okay, well, how are you going to deal with that within a governmental structure, right? I agree, part of it is a reframing, and we should do that.
I think Sally Benson has a question.
Okay, yeah. So this thought combines a couple of things that we've heard about today. First, going back to Naki's map, which showed that there were large portions of the globe that could meet their own energy needs, but then there were urban areas where they couldn't. And so that's sort of one thought. The other thing is I think that what good looked like in terms of energy sort of was the one-size-fits-all model, that everyone would have exactly the same services, the same service providers, the same infrastructure, the same technology. But perhaps as we sort of look to the future, thinking about a differentiation between the megacities, which have one set of needs and demands and opportunities, and then smaller cities, the 500,000 people or less kind of cities, perhaps we should really start thinking about, segregating the world into different classes of technologies and how one would go about meeting those needs, which would open people's eyes more to the potential for distributed generation, and at the same time recognize the realities that megacities are going to have their own kinds of requirements. Is that a useful framing or not? I'd just be curious about your opinions on that.
Well, I would just like to make a comment on your comment, because I agree with it. And I think there is a lot to say for an argument that the diversity will be increasing rather than decreasing in this transformed world, to take the opportunities at the local level that will be different in different places. And I think that the new systems and technologies will offer that. And if we move along Chris's lines toward ever more toward prosumers, people who consume and produce at the same time locally, I think diversity in it will increase also from that point of view. So I don't think we'll see much more homogenization in this transformation process.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, one of the things that is going to vary a lot, and probably even more than the sort of, resources and even the configuration of cities is what the local politics are. Because, it's politics that basically holds things back. Now, the good news, I think, New York is probably a preeminent example. The politics are totally different. I mean, you can do things at the city level that you couldn't get away with in Washington, right? I mean, Mayor Bloomberg's policy, just wouldn't fly in Washington at this point. As your C40 shows, I mean, there are an awful lot of cities that are out there getting ahead of the national governments. But we are seeing, different cities are doing it in very different ways. I mean, it's partly maybe, if you're Phoenix, you've got a better solar resource than you do in Hamburg. But, the complexity of it is shown by the fact that Hamburg is actually doing much, much more rooftop solar, even though it has a third of the resource. And that's because, the politics are different in Hamburg, and the culture is different. But, I think you're exactly right that, we're going to see tremendous diversity, and we certainly should not come up with, one sort of prescription for everybody.
Arnulf.
I would like to add, a more fundamental kind of dichotomy here, or trade-off, I think, which is important, and offer a little flippant remark on the kind of, the governability and, the enormous powers at the city scale level. There's one area, if we adopt this idea that, the technological configurations, I don't think technologies will be so different. The combinations and the systems integration of the technologies will be very diverse in my viewpoint. There is one area where decision makers at the local scale have absolutely no power, and that's on technology standards. Major Bloomberg could not enforce a standard on hybrid cars on all taxi cars in New York City, because that's actually a mandate of New York state government, and they were very keen to basically tell Major Bloomberg that he could not make this decision. So technology standards are completely out of the realm, but it's exactly these standards that will determine the flexibility and the systems configuration. So I think we need a different discourse, that we need regulatory measures for technology standards that allow this kind of flexibility and systems integration, or, a technology might be used in a microgrid or in a distributed system, and at the same time on a centralized system. And you need to make sure that from the technology like liability or interconnection and other standards, this can be done. But these kind of standards need to be done either at the international level, the EU level, or at the or national level in the US, but they cannot be done at the lower level. So we have here a significant trade-off and a dichotomy which we need to think about.
Great. At this point, I'd like to close the session down with thanks to the speakers, discussants, and audience for being totally awesome. Thank you.